Welcome to Check This Out, podcast for kids
and their grown-ups, where we explore people, places, ponderings, and past moments from history that shape the world around us. My name is Amy Contreras.
And I'm Cece.
Today, we are continuing our series on
Women Who Changed the World.
This episode of Women Who Changed the World features a woman who has a few interesting factoids about her. Do you want to hear them?
Hit me with it.
Okay, here goes. There are more statues of this woman in the United States than of any other American woman.
Wow!
She has been featured on the United States dollar coin.
That is cool.
She traveled across the country as a teenager with explorers Lewis and Clark while carrying her infant baby on her back.
What?
She had a river named in her honor.
No way!
Yes, and I'm not even done. There are 3 U.S. naval ships named after her. She was featured on a U.S. stamp. Her memory was used to help fight for women's suffrage, which is the right to vote, in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Any idea who it was? Well, listeners, if you guessed Sacagawea, you are right on the money. And if you didn't guess Sacagawea, do you know who she is? Have you ever heard of her before? If you've seen the Night at the Museum movies, you may recognize her name. But no fear if you've never heard of her before, because after today's episode, you'll be a pro.
Here we go!
This woman who changed the world is fascinating to talk about because much of what we know about her is from the perspective of other people around her. But before I dive in and start telling you all about this incredible woman, let me give you a lay of the land about the time she lived in and what led to her being so well remembered in American history today.
Where should we begin?
I think the best place to begin is with the fact that during Thomas Jefferson's presidency, he made a massive land purchase that greatly expanded the size of the United States. If you listen to our presidential mini episode on Thomas Jefferson, we talked a little bit about this moment in history. Do you remember what it was called when Thomas Jefferson basically doubled the size of the United States with a big land purchase? Was it A, the Louisiana Purchase, B, the Manifest Destiny Purchase, or C, the Mississippi Purchase?
Mama, can I guess? A.
If you guessed A, that was a great guess. Thomas Jefferson oversaw the Louisiana Purchase that happened in 1803. This is one of the biggest legacies of Thomas Jefferson's presidency. The Louisiana Purchase was a land deal between the United States and France. The United States bought 827,000 square miles of land that was west of the Mississippi River. Keep in mind, we got all that land for $15 million.
I can't believe that happened.
The Louisiana Purchase was important for a lot of reasons, but one of the big ones is that this helped block Spain, Britain, and France from being able to access and colonize North America in the way they had previously been able to do so. This was also a ton of land, and it basically doubled the size of the United States at the time. By buying all this Western land, it set the United States on a course of westward expansion and colonization across the continent that we know today as the United States.
Good to know.
Understanding the Louisiana Purchase matters because this ultimately led to a famous expedition across the North American continent that was led by 2 famous explorers and our very own topic of this week's episode, Sacagawea.
Tell me everything!
When Thomas Jefferson became president, he really hoped to drive exploration across the continent. Remember, back in 1803, they didn't have planes or drones or the internet. They didn't even have cars or highways yet. So when Jefferson bought all this land from France, he didn't even know what was on it.
You gotta be joking.
Nope. It was a very different world 220 years ago. In January of 1803, President Jefferson sent a confidential letter to Congress asking for money to fund an exploration expedition across the North American continent that would go all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Do you want to guess how much money he asked Congress for in order to fund this expedition? Was it
A.
$50,000?
B.
$25,000?
C.
$2,500.
If you pick C, that was a super duper good choice.
$2,500. $2,500. This is less than how much some people pay in rent these days. Today, $2,500 is equal to a little over $60,000 of today's money, which is a lot of money.
What happened?
Thomas got the funds from Congress, and not long after his request to Congress, the expedition took place in 1804. In 1804, about 45 men led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark headed out on their expedition. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark is kind of a mouthful, so they're often referred to as Lewis and Clark.
That makes a lot of sense.
Lewis and Clark took their party and went up the Missouri River, crossed the Rocky Mountains, took the Columbia River, and they reached the Pacific Ocean by November of 1805. But that's a big simplification of a massive and complex undertaking. Because remember, there were no roads or routes to get to the Pacific Ocean.
That must have been hard.
The goal of the expedition across the North American continent, because remember, much of where they were traveling wasn't part of the United States yet. Their goal was to establish things like diplomatic contacts with Native American tribes. They wanted to expand the fur trade. They also wanted to understand the landscape and the plants and animals they encountered. One of their big goals was also to locate the Northwest Passage.
What's that?
The Northwest Passage sadly turned out not to exist over land on the continent, but it was hoped by many in the early 1800s and 1900s that there was a direct water route or a river that could take people all the way to the Pacific Ocean from the Atlantic Ocean across the country. Otherwise known as they wanted a river that you could travel east to west from one coast to another. This mattered for trade and travel because remember, in the olden days, people couldn't just hop on a plane and fly from New York to Seattle or San Francisco like they can today. Boats, trains, wagons, horses, even walking were the main form of travel for longer passages and trade.
Check this out.
The actual Northwest Passage wasn't discovered until over 100 years later in 1906, and it required a really long and dangerous boat ride up over the top of Canada and into the Arctic Circle. The story of that discovery is cool as well, but we'll save it for another time.
Fair enough.
So back to Lewis and Clark and their expedition. As a reminder, they had a few key goals. They were supposed to get to the Pacific Ocean, establish friendly relationships with Native Americans along the way, expand the fur trade, document plant and animal life, document the landscape, and look for the Northwest Passage.
Got it.
At this point, you're probably thinking, Amy, this is an episode on Sacagawea. Why are you telling me so much about Thomas Jefferson and Lewis and Clark? And I'd say, you're right. But understanding Sacagawea's legacy matters because the reason we remember her today is tied up into the decisions, actions, and legacies of all these men we just talked about. Just talking about Sacagawea without understanding what was happening around her and the goals and motivations of the people she was with, you'd miss out on some important facts and context.
That's important.
Yes, but now I think you're ready for Sacagawea's story and the role she played in this expedition.
Let's get into it.
Sacagawea is the other most famous people in the Lewis and Clark expedition. She's often mentioned in the same breath as them and always is in the paintings and statues. Many refer to Sacagawea as the Native American guide for the expedition across the continent. Remember, I say continent and not country because it wasn't the United States yet. But right away, I want to correct some misinformation that's out there about Sacagawea, just in case you've heard it before.
I'm ready. Hit me with it.
A common misconception is actually her name. Did you know her name isn't actually pronounced Sacagawea? The pronunciation is actually Sacagawea, and I'll refer to her with that pronunciation for the rest of the episode. On the topic of her name, there is some uncertainty around the actual spelling of her name because it was written several different ways in the journals of the men she traveled with across the continent. Most notably, her name was written several different ways in the diaries of Lewis and Clark. Her name is believed to be a Hidatsa name, which is the tribe that kidnapped her when she was about 12 years old. But her birth tribe, the Shoshone, claim a different spelling. She was also nicknamed Janie by Lewis, so lots of stuff going on with her name. Another misconception is that Sacagawea was the famous guide of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Sacagawea is often portrayed as the guide in all of the films and pictures and movies and artwork. She was involved in the expedition because her husband, a French-Canadian fur trader named Toussaint Charbonneau, convinced Lewis and Clark to hire him as a guide and interpreter. Sacagawea's husband, Charbonneau, knew the Hidasta language and the sign languages common among the river tribes they would likely encounter on their journey. Sacagawea's husband, Charbonneau, also sold Lewis and Clark on the fact that he was married to Sacagawea, who was originally of the Shoshone tribe but had been living with the Hidasta since her capture as a child. He proposed this would be useful as they traveled west, since they expected to encounter and would ultimately need to trade with the Shoshone people. Artwork of Sacagawea often shows her as the guide, pointing the way, but she more regularly served as an interpreter, a translator, and someone who was familiar with the land and plants that they could eat. Her role was a lot more complex and nuanced than being a guide, and she likely only truly guided the party a handful of times, but she was certainly essential to the success and survival of all the men in the party.
I learned something new today.
So now that some of those misconceptions are out of the way, we can keep going. What we often remember today as the Lewis and Clark expedition actually went by another name when it was happening in 1804 and 1805. Do you want to guess what the expedition to the Pacific Ocean was called? Was it A, the Pacific Journey, B, the Corps of Discovery, or C, the Trade Commission?
I think it's B.
If you guessed B, Corps of Discovery, you're right. The Corps of Discovery traveled across the continent from May 14th of 1804 to September 23rd of 1806. It was made up of about 45 men and one woman. Want to take a guess who that one woman was? I hope you said it was Sacagawea. Technically, there was also a baby on the Corps of Discovery because Sacagawea gave birth to her infant son, Jean-Baptiste, on February 11th of 1805. Just a couple months after giving birth, Sacagawea and her husband and baby headed west with the Corps of Discovery. Keep in mind, she was a brand new mom and she was only 16 or 17 years old at the time. According to William Clark's journal, Sacagawea's presence on the journey helped reassure Native American tribes they encountered that the expedition was not a war party or had hostile intentions. Details of Sacagawea's role on the expedition are limited to the journals of the men she traveled with. Without these journals, we wouldn't even know about her role in the Corps of Discovery. But even without clear details, historians can assume that she took on many tasks along the journey that she would have done in her home village as well.
Like what, Mama?
Things like dressing animal hides, making moccasins, foraging for roots and berries and plants to eat. She also called out familiar landmarks along the way, letting the men know when they were getting close to places she was familiar with.
She had a lot of jobs.
Early in the expedition, only about a month in, the boat they were traveling on overturned in the water. Sacagawea earned the respect of her traveling companions because she acted fast when this happened. She gathered up important papers, books, even navigational instruments and medicines, and other provisions that might have been lost in the water if she hadn't acted fast. Keep in mind, she did all of this while also making sure that her baby, Jean-Baptiste, was safe.
What an amazing story!
These actions were so appreciated that a few days later, Lewis and Clark named a branch of the Missouri River for her.
She sounds really brave.
She was. This woman was traveling along with over 40 men and a newborn baby into a literal unknown wilderness. Do you want to guess how many miles the Corps of Discovery traveled on their journey? Was it A, 2,000 miles, B, 4,000 miles, C, 8,000 miles? If you said C, ding, 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 you got it. It was 8,000 miles.
How incredible. That's amazing.
A lot of that was on foot, sometimes on boat and horses. This was a hard trip. Nothing about it was easy. Just by participating, Sacagawea was brave.
My mind is blown.
I mentioned earlier that Sacagawea was kidnapped when she was about 12 years old by a neighboring tribe. Although documentation of her life before and after the Lewis and Clark expedition is limited, it is known that she was born to the Shoshone tribe and was kidnapped by the Hidasta. The Hidasta are who traded her to her husband. This is important because along the journey with the Corps of Discovery, the explorers encountered the Shoshone people. Sacagawea served as translator, hoping to trade for horses. And during this interaction, she realized that the chief of the Shoshone people was her brother, and they were reunited after many years of being apart because of her kidnapping and marriage.
Oh my goodness!
Reports from the journals were that it was a happy and emotional reunion, as you might expect. According to the journals of Lewis and Clark, we know that Sacagawea insisted on seeing the Pacific Ocean after such a long journey and was fascinated by it. She even saw a whale carcass that they found on the seashore. William Clark became so fond of Sacagawea's baby during the expedition that he eventually became the legal guardian of Jean-Baptiste and the daughter that Sacagawea would eventually have after the expedition was over.
That is cool.
The party reached the Pacific Ocean in November of 1805. They made their way back after seeing it, and they were greeted with a big celebration in St. Louis in September of 1806. The memory and impact of Sacagawea on this important expedition has been exaggerated, it's been falsified, it's been forgotten over the years, and little is known about her life after the expedition. It is thought that she died around 1812, but there are conflicting accounts of her death. After the exhibition, she did give birth to a daughter named Lizette, who, along with her brother, who went on the Corps of Discovery, Jean-Baptiste, they were ultimately placed under the guardianship of explorer William Clark, who Sacagawea had become friends with on the journey. The men of the Corps of Discovery were handsomely rewarded for their efforts, receiving land, money, and titles. Sacagawea received no compensation for her contributions to the expedition.
That is not okay.
Although she was not rewarded or compensated for her work on the journey, Sacagawea was a respected member of the Corps of Discovery. Journal entries from the men show she participated in votes along the way about key decisions, and both Lewis and Clark wrote about the essential role she played in the journey in their journals. This brave woman did something many men wouldn't have been able to do, all while carrying her newborn baby on the journey. This expedition changed the world. It opened up the western portion of the continent to the United States, and it laid the foundation for the expansion of the country. Today, there are valid questions and concerns about whether or not France even had a right to sell the land in the Louisiana Purchase to the United States, considering it was indigenous land first that they had taken. And while the Corps of Discovery was purely exploration, the expedition of Lewis and Clark did start to open up the West for colonization. Colonization of the West is part of the complicated legacy of the United States and our government's mistreatment of the indigenous people who were here first. But Sacagawea did change the world with her contributions to this expedition. And before we share our poem with you about Sacagawea, we have one other thing for you. Just like always, we encourage you to continue researching after the episode is over.
Here are 3 of our favorite facts.
Fact number 1. Sacagawea was only 16 or 17 when the Lewis and Clark expedition started. She had her infant baby with her on the whole 8,000-mile journey.
Fact number 2.
Sacagawea had never seen the ocean before the Corps of Discovery traveled across the continent. When she saw the ocean, she also witnessed the carcass of a beached whale. This is important because it was written about in all the journals a lot.
Fact number 3.
Sacagawea is possibly the most commemorated woman in American history. According to the National Park Service, she's the woman with the most statues in her honor. She also has a river, boats, schools, parks, and more named for her. She was featured on the U.S. dollar coin. There are stamps with her likeness and tons of art, movies, and books that reference her.
What was your favorite fact?
Keep checking out more about Sacagawea, the Lewis and Clark expedition, the Louisiana Purchase, and whatever else stood out to you in this episode. Now, before we let you go,
we wrote you a poem.
With the Corps of Discovery and Lewis and Clark, she journeyed forth, igniting a spark. Carrying her babe upon her back, she forged ahead, driving the pack. Across the land through mountains high, she sought a path beneath the sky. An interpreter, guide, and so much more, her story is one we still explore. From Shoshone roots to Hidatsa ties, her journey is tied into history's eyes. Though many men received great fame, Sacagawea walked in the shadows yet changed the game. From statues tall to coins of gold, her tale ignites hearts young and old. We hope you enjoyed this episode on Women Who Changed the World, Sacagawea. At Check This Out, we know it can be hard to know if information you find online is accurate. We use verified sources to build the stories you hear about.
Our sources are
womenshistory.org, Encyclopedia Britannica, History.com, the National Park Service, lewisandclark.org, and Monticello.org.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next episode.